Right now, the Chicago Bears have one of the worst defensive lines in the NFL. And the young players that the Bears have up front need to prove themselves first before that group's going to get any sort of respect this season, besides Montez Sweat.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On the show today, we compare the Chicago Bears defensive line to some of the other worst defensive lines in the NFL to get a better sense of where the Bears might fall in that group. And along the way in this process, I think we kind of have to separate the edge rushers, the defensive ends, and the interior defensive linemen, because between 4-3 defenses and 3-4 defenses, some teams have the outside linebackers that are kind of like they're edge rushers that aren't, I guess, technically defensive linemen if their hand's not in the dirt, but they play up on the line of scrimmage. So we're talking about defenses, guys on the line of scrimmage, whether it's a 4-3 or a 3-4. You got your interior defensive tackles and your edge rushers. And we're going to kind of look at where the Bears fall in both position groups across the league and kind of get a sense then when you put it all together, who might be worse and just how far down the Bears might stand. Obviously, Montez Sweat is the crown jewel of this Chicago Bears defensive line. He is the strongest argument against the Bears having the worst defensive line in football. When you have one pass rusher that's that good, that's been able to be as productive and as proven and consistent as Montez Sweat has been, it affords you a certain level of okay, they've got something there. It's not completely void of talent. And he's also good enough, I think, so that the Bears do not have the worst set of edge rushers in the NFL. And that's where I want to start by kind of separating out the defensive line conversation. Because I think there are some teams that have really good edge rushers, but really bad interiors. And there are some teams that have really good interior defensive tackles, but some pretty bad edge rushers. And then there are a few teams that have some struggles at both spots that I think those are the teams that you can make the arguments are maybe a little worse than where the Bears are on the defensive line. But if we start looking at just the edge rushers, obviously in Chicago, Montez Sweat on one side, DeMarcus Walker expected to start on the other side there. You drafted Austin Booker in the 5th round. You got Dominic Robinson back. They've signed Jake Martin from the Indianapolis Colts as a free agent this offseason, but it's not a group of proven edge rushers pretty much anywhere outside of Montez Sweat. DeMarcus Walker had, that 7-sack season 2 years ago with the Titans, but this past season, 3.5 sacks, kind of rotating as that starter with in and out with DeMarcus Walker and Montez Sweat coming later in that process. Even with the Ngakwe, it was kind of a rotation there, but that's kind of the Bears' edge rushing group. And for this exercise, and I'm not just saying the two starters, but really at least your top 3 guys, because every team is going to rotate different pass rushers in there. And I think some of these other teams that are weak at the edge rusher position, that I'm not necessarily here to power rank them all, bottom 1 through 5, so I guess 32nd through 28th or whatever that maths out to be, but certainly I think a team like the Atlanta Falcons are particularly weak at edge rusher. Arnold Ebiketie has been pretty good for them, but they pair him with Lorenzo Carter on the other side, and he's not anything great to write home about. And they just drafted Braylon Trice in the 3rd round. I think was that one pick right before the Bears ended up taking Karan Amagaji, Braylon Trice out of Washington. It could have been an edge rusher the Bears maybe were interested in, but regardless, okay, some young guys there, but not a lot of proven consistent ability at their edge rusher spot. Montez Sweat's former team, the Washington Commanders, also going to be one of the lower end defensive edge rusher groups in the NFL, a team that has tried to rebuild that position ever since moving on from Sweat and Chase Young in the last 12 months, a little less than that. So they went out and brought in basically the Dallas Cowboys defensive ends, Doris Armstrong and Dante Fowler Jr. They also have Clelin Ferrell, the former Raiders first-round pick, who's bounced around the league a little bit. But Armstrong has had some good production, kind of like Montez Sweat, but not quite as consistent. But Fowler's kind of been a journeyman at this point of the career. Clelin Ferrell has never really lived up to his draft status. Not a very strong edge rusher group there, but obviously they still have their two interior guys that they kept, Daron Payne and Jonathan Allen. So that's where this conversation gets, when you talk about separating edge from interior guys, the Commanders have the interior, they just don't have the edge. And the Falcons to some extent too, when they've got Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata on the inside, Zach Harrison, they just drafted Ruke Orokoro from in the second round, from the Clemson defensive tackle that whoever they had out to pronounce that name was worse than I was there. They also took Brandon Dorless from Oregon. So they've got some interior bodies in Atlanta, just not a lot of consistent edge rusher pressure there. The two other bad ones I'll throw out here, the Denver Broncos and the Arizona Cardinals. Denver, has gotten more production than the name recognition might tell you with Baron Browning and Jonathan Cooper, but those guys are not difference maker edge rushers there, that they don't generate a consistent enough pass rush. They drafted Jonah Ellis in the third round out of Utah, and then they also have Nick Bonito they took a couple years ago, but it's a pretty rough edge rusher group there in Denver. They have not fully recovered from losing Von Miller and Bradley Chubb, which is, obviously not easy to replace. And then to some extent, the Arizona Cardinals, when they're starting two Chicago Bears castoffs, Bilal Nichols and Justin Jones. They also have Kyrus Tonga on their defensive line as well. Now, the tricky thing with the Cardinals is they drafted Darius Robinson from Missouri in the first round. I'm a big fan of his coming out of the draft, and he's kind of one of these tweener hybrid. Is he a defensive tackle? Is he an edge rusher guy? So, I don't know exactly what the Cardinals' plan is with him. I think, from my understanding, is that they were going to use him at both. So it's hard to count him as a full-time defensive tackle or a full-time edge rusher, but he might play in both spots, and he certainly would be their best interior defensive lineman and maybe their best edge rusher as well, because, you look at their edge, it's B.J. Ojulari and Zaven Collins on the outside. Ojulari and Collins were both early draft picks, but they have not been consistently productive players. So they keep hoping for more from those guys, but it's not a very strong edge rusher group there. Darius Robinson could be the best edge rusher on that team, and he could be the best interior defensive tackle on that team. But if your best player at both positions is your 27th overall pick in this year's draft, it's not a great spot that your defensive line is in. I was surprised going through some of these NFL defensive lines, how many teams are surprisingly really solid at defensive tackle. A lot of teams you look around oh yeah, there's a lot of teams that are really set there. Then a lot more teams have a lot more questions at edge rushers. Quietly, I don't want to be blasphemous or hot takey here, but quietly, the Kansas City Chiefs edge rusher spot, nothing elite by any means. I'm not going to say they're nearly as bad as some of these other teams that we talked about, but it's George Karlaftis was great, but they don't got much else besides Karlaftis there generating a consistent pass rush. And the Baltimore Ravens too, again, not horrible by any means, but Kyle Van Noy and Odafe Owe, Van Noy had 8 or 9 sacks last season. Yeah, they got some pass rush there, but both of those defensive lines anchored by their interior there. And you can also throw the Seahawks and the Buccaneers don't have great edge rushers either, but the Bears are kind of in this conversation among some of these bottom teams. I think Sweat puts them ahead of probably the teams like the Cardinals and the Broncos and the Atlanta Falcons there in terms of purely the edge rusher spot, but some of those teams have a lot better interiors than what the Bears do. So as a result, maybe the Bears have a slightly better edge because of Montez Sweat, but worse interior guys. So then does that make the defensive line as a whole better or worse? Well, let's take a look at just how the Bears interior of Andrew Billings and Javon Dexter and Zach Pickens compares to some of the other groups that have concerns around the rest of the NFL. Next. Next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Gametime, the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. If you're looking at this Bears schedule and want to lock down tickets to go to a Bears game this season, Gametime is going to be the best way to get tickets because you get to view your view from your seat before you buy that seat. Before you get your tickets, you can see right in Soldier Field or whatever stadium or venue your tickets are in. You can see exactly what you're going to get when you get to your seat. So you know what you're paying for, and you know exactly how much you're going to pay too, because Gametime has all-in pricing. So you're not getting any of those added taxes or fees thrown on at the end that you weren't expecting, and all of a sudden the tickets cost way more than you thought on the front end. Like, it's a great way to get tickets for football games. I bought a couple different Bears games tickets on Gametime last year. Concerts, comedy shows, theater shows, any kind of live event, Gametime is the way to go. I've got a bunch of concerts tickets on my phone for the rest of this summer on Gametime that I'm really excited to get to. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. The Bears might very well have the worst defensive tackle group in the NFL until Gervon Dexter and Zach Pickens can prove otherwise. Certainly, you can see all the potential in the world for those guys to be able to step up into bigger roles this season, be more productive than they were last year. But as we sit in the middle of, or I guess towards the end of May, two-thirds, three-fourths of the way through May, however, whatever, right now, we still need to see Gervon Dexter be more than just a guy who flashes a little bit. And we need to see Zach Pickens be more than just a guy who flashes a little bit. I love Andrew Billings as a nose tackle, but like, one pretty good nose tackle does not make a quality defensive tackle interior defensive line group for the Chicago Bears. Now, there are some other teams with some pretty unproven poor defensive tackle groups, and I can certainly see where by week 4, week 8, Gervon Dexter proves and is playing well enough, and it clearly then isn't the worst defensive tackle group in the NFL. But it doesn't help that the Bears really don't have much depth at all behind them either on the interior, whereas other teams can go a couple of rotations deep on the defensive tackle spot and be able to get more consistent play out there. So it definitely going to be a less of a strong argument in favor of the Bears here, but you don't have to look far from Soldier Field up to Minnesota, where it's not a great interior defensive line there either. Like, they lost, on the edge, of course, they lost Danielle Hunter this offseason, but drafted Dallas Turner in the first round, and they signed Jonathan Greenard as a free agent and Andrew Van Ginkel as a free agent. Like, they rebuilt their edge rusher spot in Minnesota, but they couldn't do much about the interior defensive line. They're still going to start former Chicago Bears third-round pick Jonathan Bullard at one of their defensive end spots. They're 3-4 defensive end spot. On the other side, it's Jerry Tillery, who's been a Charger and a Raider and has always kind of just been a middle of the pack starter type guy. And then they brought in Harrison Phillips, the nose tackle from Buffalo, who's a pretty decent nose tackle, but like, that interior defensive line group is really not giving you a lot there. Like, Jonathan Bullard probably should not be a starting caliber player at this point. And I think Jerry Tillery, there was more optimism that he could develop into something a little bit better than he's been up to this point in his career, but like, he's bounced around a lot and hasn't really been a starter the last season or two. So like, for Minnesota to bring him in and kind of rely on him as a starter again is not a good interior group at all. Now, I still think, guys like Tillery and certainly Harrison Phillips have some level of proven production, more so than what we've seen from Dexter and Pickens so far. But again, like I said, like, over the course of this season, Dexter and Pickens can establish themselves as better defensive tackles than some of the other guys on this list. But just based on what we've actually seen so far, we can hope and we can project and we can expect. But right now, this is not a better defensive tackle group from the Bears there. Or look, another one where it's like the Chargers, Khalil Mack, Joey Bosa, of course, as far as their total defensive line goes, having those two guys on the edge makes their defensive line formidable. Their interior is not a group that you're really all that concerned about as an opposing offensive line. From left to right in their 3-4, it's Morgan Fox, former Carolina Panther they brought over. They signed Poona Ford as a free agent from the Buffalo Bills, and then a couple years ago they drafted Tito Ogbania as their nose tackle. Like, they took Justin Ibobi from Alabama in the 4th round, who's got some potential there, but that is just not an interior group that you may not have heard of any of the players we mentioned there. Maybe Poona Ford, you remember from his days with the Seahawks. I think he was a 1st-round pick for them, if I remember correctly. No, he was an undrafted free agent, but he ended up starting for them for quite a way. So he's been around the block, but like that's not a group where it's like they're going to generate a pass rush that you're worried about. Or they're going to shut down your running game that well. Like not nothing to be super proud of there. But like when you add in the totality of their edge rushers, certainly a better defensive line with Bosa and Mack than what the Chicago Bears work with. So that's where you can start to compare side to side, like interior guys versus interior guys and edge guys versus edge guys, but you bring in the whole picture, and these other defensive lines have more, at least one of the two spots, than what the Bears have, where it's really kind of just feels like Montez Sweat or bust. But then you've got a team like the Denver Broncos, who, again, I don't think they're terrible on the interior. They did sign Zach Allen as a free agent from the Cardinals a couple years ago, who, remember, the Bears were going after in free agency. I thought Allen kind of underachieved his first year in Denver, but we've seen him be better before. DJ Jones, their nose tackle, was pretty good. John Franklin Myers, I guess, he's came over from the Jets. He's flashed a little bit at times in his career. Like, those are not household names, but I think those are guys who can do more, but still don't think they're a very good interior there. And we're kind of back to the Arizona Cardinals again, too, where it's like, okay, is Darius Robinson an interior or an exterior guy? But we already mentioned Bilal Nichols and Justin Jones on that interior. Kyrus Tonga, like guys that aren't good enough to make the Bears, or that the Bears didn't want to keep around on their defensive line anymore. Like, not a really strong interior there either. So all of a sudden you can kind of piece together that two other defensive lines that make both of these lists, the Denver Broncos and the Arizona Cardinals. Like, those two to me are the teams that you can make the strongest argument to say those defensive lines are worse than the Chicago Bears, even right now. But everyone else seems to kind of have a little bit of something. Vikings are bad interior, but good edge rushers. The Chargers, not a good interior, strong, proven edge rushers. On the other side, we talked about the Falcons. Not much on the edge, but some interior guys you might like. Same thing is true with a couple of the other teams we talked about, the Cardinals and the Broncos, the Commanders as well. Like, I think the Buccaneers and Seahawks are kind of in that conversation too, like where they've got interior guys, but not so much some of the exterior guys. So we'll put it kind of all together and compare, this Bears defensive line against, really, I think the Cardinals and the Broncos head-to-head are the strongest arguments here. Next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL playoffs, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. So you bet on the Timberwolves, you bet on the Boston Celtics, the Indiana Pacers. I'm trying to remember who the Timberwolves are playing in the West. The Dallas Mavericks, or of course any of the hockey playoffs, any $5 bet, if your bet wins, they're going to add an additional $150 in bonus bets into your account that you can use to bet on anything. You could bet on Caleb Williams passing yards as a rookie, Rome Odunze receiving yards. Odds are already there for Bears week 1 against the Titans. Bears are favored in that game on FanDuel, so those $150 in bonus bets can go to all of them. To get that bonus money, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. The Chicago Bears combination of lacking edge rushers not named Montez Sweat and lacking proven consistency on interior, despite having some potential there, makes them tough to defend the quality of their defensive line. Again, the potential is there. Walker can be better. Dexter can be better. Pickens can be better. Booker can be a surprise. Dominique Robinson can be better. But there's a lot of ifs and can be's and could be's or should be's or you hope they will be X, Y, and Z, as opposed to they are good. They are better. And that's where we still need to see it this season before we can say, okay, this defensive line group is actually pretty good. And we'll probably hear about it at OTAs and training camp and the preseason of like, oh, this player, Devon Dexter's looking big, fast, and strong. Of course, players aren't going to have pads on, so, how much is that really going to mean? Until we see it week 1 against the Titans, week 2 against the Texans, week 3 against the Colts, if they're getting a pass rush from those guys consistently, then we can say, all right, this Bears defensive line is taking that step forward and is achieving at the level that we need to see them achieve. But until we see that, they're not anything proven as a defensive line that's not any better than most of these other groups in the NFL. To me, the Broncos and the Cardinals are the ones that kind of stand out the most to me as like, I think those two, you can make a pretty strong argument, are worse than the Bears. So that would leave the Bears as the 30th ranked defensive line. I mean, there's others that you can kind of nitpick, but like that's kind of the situation we're in. I certainly don't think you can get anywhere above 25. I mean, this is a bottom third defensive line right now. Is probably the highest I would go with you right now. Of course, you sign a free agent defensive tackle, you sign a free agent edge rusher, you trade for one, you find a way to acquire more talent there. That changes the conversation. But right now, okay, your edge rushers, Sweat, Walker, and Booker. I don't know. I think that edge group is slightly better than, the Broncos have Browning, Cooper, and Ellis, the rookie. I think I'd take Sweat, Walker, and Booker over that group. And then, Zaven Collins, B.J. Ojolari, and Darius Robinson with the Cardinals. So Robinson as a first-round pick elevates a lot there for me. But I think Montez Sweat is better than any of the three of them. I think, like, the Cardinals top to bottom there is a little bit more solid. Like, all three of those guys are better than Austin Booker, and all three of those guys are at least as good as DeMarcus Walker. But Sweat is better than any of the Cardinals edge rushers. So how you want to split that up, I think Montez Sweat could be the difference maker there, but we'll see. And then on the interior, like Dexter Billings and Pickens, okay, like I think Zach Allen of the Broncos should be better than Dexter Billings or Pickens, but he wasn't great last season. He didn't live up to the contract year one last season. He was good, but not great. And then I think the rest of that defensive line is kind of whatever. So maybe the Broncos are slightly better on the interior, but the Bears are better on the edge. So how you want to parse that out, I don't know. And then the Cardinals, again, same thing. If Darius Robinson is a defensive tackle for them, he's better than any of the defensive tackles on the Bears. But like Bilal Nichols and Justin Jones are not better than Dexter and Billings and Pickens as a defensive line. So, it's like you can't necessarily count Robinson twice, but where do you count him once at one of those two positions? Like wherever you count Robinson, they might be better than the Bears, but at whatever position then you don't count Robinson, they are not better than the Bears at that spot. And so again, how you want to split these guys exactly, I certainly think we expect Dexter to take a big step forward. We expect Walker to be a little bit better. Like those things seem like the bare minimum. And if we assume those things happen, then I'll say the Bears defensive line is better than the Broncos and the Cardinals. If Dexter doesn't take a step forward, if Walker continues to underwhelm, this will be the worst defensive line in the NFL. That's kind of where this Bears D-line stands. I think we said on yesterday's podcast, like the best case scenario for this Bears defensive line is that they're good enough as they stand right now. That Dexter and Billings and Pickens and Sweat and Walker and Booker and Robinson, like if they can all be just good enough, get the job done at a base level, all right. That's all you can hope for from this Bears defensive line. Super, super happy with the success there. But there's a lot of outcomes where that's not the case. Where, okay, maybe Pickens gets better, but Dexter still struggles a little bit. So you rotate those guys around and try and make something happen. And maybe Austin Booker is a nice surprise off the bench, but DeMarcus Walker doesn't get back to being a 7-sack guy and is just kind of a okay, Dominique Robinson kind of edge rusher where he'll get a sack or two, but always leave you wanting a little more. Well, then maybe that's not getting the job done. And of course, that brings down the back seven and it, of course, makes everyone's job more difficult. Like that's where it still feels like it's important for Ryan Poles to be able to address this defensive line in some meaningful fashion here. Some level of, whether it's a guy who's a free agent on the street right now. I mean, we've mentioned Calais Campbell's name a number of times, I think, over the course of this offseason. Unique Ngakoue as a potential, reunion back in Chicago. Emmanuel Ogbah from the Miami Dolphins. Like, I'm not sure some of these guys don't necessarily put this team totally over the top, but at least to have some kind of additional body there where then DeMarcus Walker could kick inside and be more of a defensive tackle and add more at that position. I mean, just give me another proven player here to feel like, okay, we've got something else to give some depth here that you can trust, because there's just not a lot at the defensive tackle position out there either that you feel like, wow, this is going to be a really big upgrade. But the Bears also don't have a lot of depth behind their defensive tackles right now. I mean, it's Dexter and Billings, and then Zach Pickens, and then, Michael Dwumfor, Byron Coward at defensive tackle, a couple of undrafted free agents. Like, there's a few more names at the defensive end spot, but not a lot of, like, proven guys. It's backups from the Colts like Jake Martin and Khalid Kareem. Again, a couple, an undrafted free agent or two in there. It's like, okay, you don't have a lot of other options where you're like, okay, well, maybe you don't have a great stud at the top, but at least you got 5 or 6 guys you can rotate through. It's like, it's not even really that. It's Dexter Billings Pickens and then it's Slim Pickens after Zach Pickens on the depth chart. And at defensive end, it's Sweat and Walker. And then you hope some combination of Booker and Robinson and Martin and Kareem can give you some kind of number 3, number 4 edge rusher out of that competition. But you're, again, kind of like saying if they can, you hope they can, could they? We're optimistic they will, they should, they could, like, but they aren't yet. And so we still need to see them be that before we can be really confident that we can assume all we want that these players are going to get better, but we still like see that to believe that and really then be able to trust that instead of just hoping that all these young players get better. Because again, not every young player is going to get better. Not every young player is going to get better at the same pace. And even veteran players have ups and downs too. And guys that might have a down year and then have an up year and then have a down year. So we'll see what that means for guys like DeMarcus Walker or Andrew Billings as well in this process who, there's a reason those guys weren't more expensive free agents either, because they're not like dominant players that are huge difference makers on your defensive line. So that's where like I want to make sure we have the appropriate level of concern about this Bears defensive line. Like it's rough. It's among the worst in the NFL. It might not be the worst, but the moment Montez Sweat has an injury, it's the worst defensive line in football, right? I mean, if he misses any games whatsoever, and he's been an Iron Man throughout most of his career, he's not a guy that has had any kind of injury concern or anything like that. But the moment he's off the field, you give him a play off to take a break. Yeah, the 4 players you got in the field are probably going to be the combination of the 4 worst players on a defensive line in the NFL because he's that important to what this group does. So it's like injuries and fatigue and breaks are a natural part of the league, and the Bears defensive line is not currently built to address that. Now, free agency, a waiver wire pickup, a trade of some kind changes the conversation a little bit. So let's hope Ryan Poles still has something else in the works to give us something to be a little bit more confident about this Bears defensive line. I'd love to hear what you think Poles should do to address this defensive line. Let us know in the comments here on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, or you can tweet us at Locked On Bears, or you can post in the Locked On Bears Facebook group. However you do it, just make sure that you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to the podcast, because that's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Keep making us your first listen each day this week. Bears OTAs are underway, and we're going to start getting updates from there. I believe we'll hear from coaches and players on Thursday, so I guess that'd probably be Friday's podcast that we'll actually hear from them, but we'll certainly get practice updates and any big news that comes out of OTAs. We'll break it all down for you right here on the podcast, and in the process, we'll make sure that we give you another opportunity to bear down.